Sophie Mitchell had been making the same latte for Ethan Blackwell every morning for 5 years, 3 months, and 17 days. Not that she was counting. She definitely was not the type to count such things. Yet every single Tuesday and Thursday, when he'd sweep into the executive kitchen on the 42nd floor of the Blackwell Tower in San Francisco, she knew exactly how many seconds it would take him to wrinkle his nose at whatever was already brewing in the machine, mutter something about corporate mediocrity, and wait for her to brew a fresh one. Today was Tuesday. Sophie's reflection stared back at her from the brushed steel espresso machine. Dark eyes, framed by reading glasses she'd forgotten to remove, a strand of black hair escaping her usually immaculate bun, and a coffee stain on her cream blouse that she'd acquired approximately 45 minutes ago when Cameron Blackwell had crashed into her desk while chasing a rolling chair down the hallway like a man possessed. "Still making miracles happen, I see," a familiar voice drawled from behind her. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Ethan Blackwell had a presence that announced itself like a low-frequency hum, something you felt in your bones before you actually saw him. At 32, he was all sharp angles and sharper intellect, with dark blonde hair, always styled with the precision of someone who'd never experienced a bad hair day in his life. His charcoal suit probably cost more than her monthly rent. Everything about him screamed control, ambition, and a complete inability to smile unless there was a financial gain involved. "Your usual," Sophie said, sliding the perfect cappuccino across the counter without looking at him. 2.5 shots of espresso, steamed milk heated to exactly 65 degrees Celsius, 1 centimeter foam, sprinkle of cocoa powder. "You're terrifying sometimes, Mitchell," Ethan said, but there was no warmth in it. It was the kind of compliment delivered by someone who viewed kindness as inefficiency. She finally glanced up. His pale blue eyes were already scanning his phone, his jaw working as he read whatever crisis was brewing in the technology sector this morning. He took a sip of the latte without tasting it. She could tell by the automatic motion, and was already turning away. "The Henderson file is on your desk," Sophie called after him. "Revised contracts, second draft." He nodded once, the acknowledgement of a king to a particularly useful servant, and disappeared around the corner toward his corner office. Sophie sighed and returned to her desk on the adjacent level, the open plan area where she managed the calendars, communications, and general chaos of being secretary to not one, but 2 of the most demanding men in San Francisco's tech scene. Being secretary to the Blackwell brothers was like being the conductor of an orchestra, where both musicians actively hated each other and insisted on playing different symphonies simultaneously. The company, Blackwell Technologies, had been founded 15 years ago by their father, Richard Blackwell, a visionary who'd somehow managed to produce 2 sons with virtually nothing in common. Ethan had inherited their father's obsession with control and perfection. Every system had to be optimized, every process streamlined, every meeting kept to its allocated time block. Cameron, 3 years younger, had inherited their father's creativity and risk-taking nature, but had weaponized it into a kind of beautiful chaos that made Ethan's eye twitch. 6 months ago, Richard had retired, and the brothers had agreed to split the company equally, a decision that had proven to be one of the worst in corporate history. They couldn't agree on quarterly goals, product development priorities, or even which coffee brand the office should stock. Sophie had found herself in the middle of an endless Cold War, playing Switzerland in an increasingly hostile territory. "Mitchell!" a cheerful voice bellowed across the floor. "Tell Ethan that my idea for the AI integration is genius and he's being a boring old man about it." Cameron Blackwell appeared at her desk like a golden retriever in an Hermes suit, tousled honey blonde hair, bright green eyes, and the kind of easy confidence that came from never having disappointed yourself. He was dressed in a vintage band t-shirt under an obviously expensive blazer, and his shoes were those actually Crocs. "Good morning, Cameron," Sophie said, fighting a smile. I'm not delivering that message in those exact words. Fine, fine. Tell him I said his conservative approach is slowly suffocating innovation. Cameron perched on the corner of her desk, somehow making casual destruction of personal space look charming. And grab me actually, surprise me, whatever you think I should have. A green juice and a stern talking to about personal boundaries? Sophie suggested. Brilliant! You're promoted. Wait, you're already doing everything around here. Never mind. He hopped off her desk and loped toward his office, which was, mercifully, on a different floor, leaving a trail of actual charm in his wake. Sophie shook her head and returned to the real nightmare of her morning, the Henderson file. The Henderson file was supposed to be a standard venture capital partnership agreement. Blackwell Technologies was set to merge with Henderson Enterprises, a move that would have positioned the company as a dominant force in the sustainable tech sector. It should have been routine, profitable, exactly the kind of alliance that Ethan had been advocating for, and that Cameron had been actively sabotaging by proposing 17 different alternative partnerships, all of which were worse. But the contracts on her desk this morning made her stomach clench. There were two versions. One, the original marked final, was the legitimate Henderson agreement. The other, marked alternative, was a completely different contract, a hostile takeover agreement. The kind of document you'd file if you wanted to acquire a company by force, stripping its board and replacing leadership. It was aggressive, illegal adjacent, exactly the kind of thing Cameron would dream up at 2 in the morning while drinking too much espresso. Sophie's hands trembled as she picked up her phone. This was bad. This was Shakespearean levels of bad, the kind of corporate catastrophe that destroyed companies and ended careers. She was supposed to deliver the correct file to Ethan's office, the legitimate Henderson agreement. But Ethan had been short with her this morning, more distracted than usual, his eyes carrying the weight of a man at his breaking point. And Cameron, sweet, chaotic Cameron, had no idea what he'd accidentally left on her desk. Sophie made a decision that would, in retrospect, be the worst administrative choice of her entire life. She grabbed both contracts, marched to Ethan's office, and placed them on his obsessively organized desk. "I need you to look at the Henderson revisions," she said firmly, "and maybe check in with Cameron about some of his alternative ideas. He seems really invested in—" "Sophie, I don't have time for his fantasies," Ethan interrupted, already signing documents without looking at her. "Just file the legitimate contracts with legal. Have them sent to Henderson's team by noon and—" "Right, yes, of course," Sophie said quickly. Too quickly. She'd done something catastrophic. She could feel it in her bones. Back at her desk, she stared at her computer screen, trying to remember exactly which contract No, she knew exactly which one she'd grabbed. The legitimate Henderson agreement was somewhere on Ethan's desk, mixed with his other papers. The hostile takeover proposal was the one that needed to go to the legal team, except she'd placed both on his desk, and he'd been signing things without reading them, and she'd just told him to send the contracts to Henderson's legal team by noon. Sophie's fingers hovered over her keyboard. She could call him back. She could fix this. She could— "Sophie Mitchell, my office. Now!" The voice came from the speakerphone, unmistakably Ethan's, carrying the tone of a man who'd just discovered something absolutely catastrophic. Her heart stopped. She stood on trembling legs, smoothed her skirt, and walked toward her doom. When she pushed open the door to his office, Ethan was standing at his floor-to-ceiling windows, facing away from her, holding two contracts. His shoulders were rigid. His jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscle working from across the room. "Explain," he said quietly, "why you placed a hostile takeover agreement, Sophie, on my desk, mixed in with the legitimate Henderson contracts." Sophie's voice came out as a whisper. "I made a mistake. I was trying to tell you about Cameron's ideas, and I grabbed both files, and Did you send this to Henderson?" He turned around, and his pale blue eyes were absolutely glacial. "No, I mean, I don't think so. I was supposed to, but I wanted to make sure You wanted to make sure I what? Understood that my brother is trying to sabotage the most important merger in our company's history. That he's planning a hostile takeover of Henderson Enterprises while pretending to collaborate on a partnership. Ethan's voice was getting quieter, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. Did you know about this, Sophie? Are you working with him? What? No, of course not. Sophie felt tears prickling her eyes, which was absolutely the wrong response to have in front of Ethan Blackwell. I was trying to help. I thought if I showed you both options, maybe you two could actually communicate about. That is not your job, Ethan said coldly. Your job is to maintain confidentiality, follow instructions, and not interfere in strategic business decisions that are, quite frankly, far above your pay grade. You've just potentially exposed a confidential company strategy to my brother. You've contaminated a critical contract negotiation, and you did it based on your feelings about inter-office relationships. The words landed like physical blows. Every one of them was designed to hurt, and every one of them found its target. I'm sorry, Sophie whispered. I'll fix it. How exactly do you propose to fix the fact that you cannot follow simple instructions? Ethan was moving toward her now, and she could see the barely controlled fury beneath the surface. This merger is worth $80 million. Our reputation depends on discretion and competence, and you've managed to compromise both in the span of 30 minutes. The phone on his desk buzzed. His assistant's voice came through. Mr. Ethan Blackwell, you have Richard Blackwell on line 2. He says it's urgent. Ethan's face went absolutely white. Get out, he said to Sophie, his voice hollow. Get out of my office. Sophie left, her vision blurred, her heart absolutely shattered. She could hear his voice through the walls as he picked up the phone. Dad, yes, I can explain. No, the contracts haven't been sent yet, but there's been a complication. She sat at her desk, shaking, trying not to think about the fact that she'd just destroyed the merger that had consumed Ethan's life for 18 months. She'd just interfered in a strategic business decision that she had absolutely no right to touch. She'd just proved every criticism leveled against her, that she was overstepping, that she was too invested, that she was a secretary who didn't know her place. The elevator dinged. Cameron emerged, 2 cups of what looked like herbal tea in his hands. Hey, did you talk to Ethan about... He stopped, taking in her red eyes and hunched shoulders. Whoa. What happened? Why do you look like someone killed your puppy? I made a terrible mistake, Sophie said quietly. A career-ending mistake. Oh, no. Cameron's easy charm evaporated. What did you do? Sophie explained. She watched his face go through a series of expressions. Confusion, realization, horror, and finally, something that looked dangerously like guilt. That was my idea, he said quietly. The hostile takeover. I was going to talk to him about it after I convinced him the Henderson partnership was a bad move, but then Ethan went ahead and he ran his hands through his hair. This is not on you, Sophie. This is on me. I'm going to tell him that But the office door banged open with enough force to shake the glass partition. Ethan stood there, his face ashen, his suit jacket abandoned, his tie loosened like he'd been choking. His pale blue eyes were wild in a way Sophie had never seen before. Both of you, he said, his voice strange and distant. My office. Now. Ethan's office felt smaller with 3 people in it. Sophie stood rigidly near the door, her hands clasped so tightly her fingernails were leaving crescents in her palms. Cameron lounged against the bookshelf with the casual posture of someone about to be scolded by their mother, which wasn't entirely inaccurate given the way Ethan was looking at both of them. Sit down, Ethan said, pointing to the chairs in front of his desk. His voice was hollow, detached, like it was coming from very far away. Sophie and Cameron exchanged a glance. She sat immediately. Cameron took his time, stretching it out in a way designed to annoy his brother. Dad just called, Ethan began, moving to his desk with the mechanical precision of someone operating on autopilot. Richard received a call from Tom Henderson. Apparently, Henderson found out about the hostile takeover proposal through, let's call it a fortuitous leak in our communications. Sophie's stomach dropped through the floor. Tom is no longer interested in the partnership, Ethan continued, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of a collapsing world. He's filing a restraining order against Blackwell Technologies for attempted corporate sabotage. Our reputation is in shambles. Investors are pulling out, and he looked directly at Cameron. Our board of directors just voted to suspend both of us pending an internal investigation. The words landed like bombs. Sophie's vision started to tunnel. That's impossible, Cameron said, finally straightening up. They can't suspend us without due process. We own the company. We own it together, Ethan said quietly, which means neither of us can make unilateral decisions, including hiring or firing the secretary who contaminated our most critical negotiation. He turned to Sophie, and his pale blue eyes were so cold they could have frozen carbon dioxide. You're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Ethan, come on, Cameron protested. Sophie didn't know what she was doing. I'm the one who wrote that proposal. I'm the one who tried to sabotage me. Yes, I'm aware. Ethan's laugh was bitter and broken. This is what happens when you can't keep your creative destruction confined to your own portfolio. This is what happens when we try to run a company together. This is what happens when people who have no business making strategic decisions insert themselves into corporate warfare. He was looking at Sophie when he said that last part. Mr. Blackwell, Sophie started, but her voice cracked. Security, Ethan said into his intercom. Please escort Ms. Mitchell from the building. Have her access cards deactivated. Sophie stood on shaking legs. She couldn't look at either brother as she moved toward the door. She couldn't process that she'd just lost her job, her income, her identity for the past 5 years. All because she'd made one mistake, one moment of misguided good intentions. As she reached the door, Cameron grabbed her arm. Sophie, wait! Don't! Ethan said sharply. Don't make this worse, Cameron. Sophie pulled her arm away gently and walked out, her head high, even though inside she was absolutely shattering. The security guard was waiting by her desk, a kind older man named Derek, who'd always made small talk with her about his grandchildren. He looked deeply uncomfortable about the whole situation. Just grab your personal items, he said quietly. I'll walk you down. Sophie's hands moved through the motions, grabbing the small potted plant on her desk, the framed photo of her parents, the wool cardigan she kept for cold office days. Everything else, 5 years of institutional knowledge, 5 years of learned systems, 5 years of being necessary to something, stayed behind. The elevator ride down was the longest journey of her life. Sophie's apartment in the Mission District was a studio that cost far too much and offered very little in return. A Murphy bed, a kitchenette that could barely fit 2 people, and a window that looked onto another building. But it was hers, paid for by honest work, and right now it felt like the only place in the world she could breathe. She sat on her bed in the dark for approximately 4 hours, which was probably unhealthy, but felt absolutely necessary. Her phone had been buzzing constantly, texts from friends asking if she wanted to grab drinks, emails from her mother asking her to call, notifications from various apps she'd signed up for and forgotten about. At 6 o'clock, there was a knock on her door. Sophie didn't move. She had no friends who knew where she lived well enough to show up unannounced, and she'd already decided that Cameron Blackwell could go directly to hell, regardless of how guilty he looked. The knock came again, more insistent. Go away, she called. Sophie, it's me. Cameron's voice came through the door, slightly muffled. I'm not leaving until you let me in. Then you're going to have a very long night standing in a hallway, Sophie replied flatly. I can do this all night, Mitchell. I have nowhere to be. My brother suspended me from the company, and I've got nothing but time and crushing guilt. There was a pause. Also, I've got Thai food, real Thai food, not that Americanized stuff. Your favorite, the pad thai with extra lime. Despite everything, Sophie's stomach growled. She opened the door. Cameron stood there holding a large paper bag that smelled absolutely incredible, wearing the same ridiculous outfit from this morning. The vintage band t-shirt, the expensive blazer, and those inexplicable Crocs. His green eyes were red-rimmed and he looked genuinely miserable. "You can't fix this with pad thai," Sophie said, but she stepped aside to let him in. "I can try," Cameron said, moving past her to her tiny kitchenette and beginning to unpack containers with the efficiency of someone who'd spent time in small spaces. "Also, I brought mango sticky rice because I'm a coward and need all the reinforcements I can get." They ate in silence for the first few minutes, sitting on her bed because it was the only seating available. The pad thai was incredible, perfectly balanced between sweet, spicy, and sour. The kind of thing that made her remember why she'd fallen in love with San Francisco in the first place. "I'm sorry," Cameron said finally, "for putting you in that position. For putting that proposal on your desk in the first place. For all of it." "You should be," Sophie said, but there was no real anger in it. "I lost my job because of your corporate games." "I know." Cameron ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that suddenly made him look much younger than 30. "I've been thinking about it all afternoon, and I realized that I've been using you as a buffer between me and Ethan for months. You'd deliver my ideas, he'd shut them down. I'd blame him for not listening, when really I was just too much of a coward to have an actual conversation with my brother." Sophie ate another bite of pad thai and didn't respond. What was there to say? That she'd known this? That she'd actively enabled it? "I talked to Dad," Cameron continued, "and he's not happy with either of us. Ethan especially, for firing you without cause. Apparently there are laws about that, and Dad's very aware of them." "I don't want to be rehired out of legal obligation," Sophie said quietly. "That's somehow worse than being fired in anger." "Then don't be." Cameron turned to face her fully, and there was something different about him now, less charm, more actual human being underneath. "Instead, become the CEO." Sophie choked on her pad thai. "Excuse me?" She coughed, reaching for water. "Hear me out," Cameron said quickly. "Ethan and I can't run this company together. We've proven that beyond a shadow of a doubt. Dad's been trying to push us both to hire a neutral third party to actually lead, but Ethan keeps rejecting every candidate because none of them are controlling enough, and I keep rejecting them because none of them are creative enough. Cameron, I'm a secretary. I have no CEO experience, no business degree, no—" "You have 5 years of managing both of us simultaneously," Cameron interrupted. "You understand our product. You know our team. You can navigate between opposing viewpoints without losing your mind. And most importantly, you're not either of us, so you don't have our baggage or our egos." "Your brother just fired me," Sophie said flatly. "He said I was above my pay grade. He made it very clear that my input is not welcome." "Ethan says a lot of things when he's panicking," Cameron said. "What he doesn't say is usually more important. Did he actually look happy about firing you? Or did he look like someone who'd just kicked a puppy and hated himself for it?" Sophie had been trying very hard not to think about the look in Ethan's eyes when he'd told her to leave. She'd been trying not to remember that he'd looked absolutely wrecked. "This is insane," she said. "Completely insane," Cameron agreed. "But also genius. Think about it. It solves everything. You get a promotion and a substantial raise. Ethan and I get to step back without actually losing face. The company gets real leadership. And I get to go back to what I'm actually good at, which is product development, instead of trying to run operations." "Your brother will have a stroke," Sophie said. "Probably," Cameron agreed cheerfully. "But here's the thing, Dad's already on board. He thinks you're exactly what this company needs. And technically, as the retired founder, he still has controlling interest in major personnel decisions. If we propose it correctly, Ethan can't actually stop it." Sophie set down her pad thai, suddenly unable to taste it. "I need to think about this." "Fair," Cameron said, respecting the boundary in a way his brother never would have. "But think fast. because Dad wants to announce it at tomorrow's board meeting, and if we're going to pull this off, we need you to be ready." He left about an hour later, after helping her with her dishes, and somehow making her tiny apartment feel less depressing through sheer force of personality. Sophie sat in the dark again after he was gone, staring at the ceiling of her studio, trying to process the fact that her worst day might have somehow become the beginning of something extraordinary, or something that would spectacularly explode in approximately 48 hours. The next morning, Sophie stood outside the Blackwell Tower in her best suit, navy, professional, the kind of thing you wore when you wanted to be taken seriously, but couldn't afford to look like you'd actually hired a stylist. She'd spent the entire night planning, researching, and practicing her CEO voice, which apparently involved speaking from a slightly lower register and not apologizing for existing. The elevator ride up felt surreal. She'd made this journey 5,000 times, but never as anything other than an employee heading to her desk, never as someone with a seat in the boardroom. Cameron was waiting for her on the 42nd floor. He was dressed nicer than usual, slacks that actually fit, a button-down shirt in a pale blue that matched his eyes, hair actually combed. Behind him stood their father, Richard Blackwell, a man in his early 60s with silver threading through his dark hair and the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd built an empire from nothing. "Ms. Mitchell," Richard said, extending his hand, "Cameron tells me you're willing to take on a rather unusual challenge." "I'm not sure I'm qualified," Sophie said honestly, shaking his hand firmly. "Neither was I when I started this company in my garage," Richard replied with a slight smile. "Qualification is often just another word for willingness to learn under pressure. Come, let's go break my eldest son's world." The boardroom was on the top floor, with windows that showed all of San Francisco spreading out beneath them like something out of a fever dream. Ethan was already there, seated at the head of the long glass table, reviewing documents with the intensity of someone determined not to make eye contact with anyone entering the room. He looked up when Sophie walked in, and she watched his face go through a series of expressions: confusion, anger, a flash of something that might have been regret. "What is this?" he said coldly. "A board meeting," Richard said, taking his place at the table with the casual authority of someone who'd built the room. "Sit down, Sophie." Sophie sat directly across from Ethan, which meant she had to watch his jaw clench and his pale blue eyes narrow with growing fury as Richard began to speak. "For the past 18 months, Richard began, "you two have proven categorically unable to run this company together. Your conflict has compromised deals, confused the team, and nearly destroyed our reputation. Today, I'm exercising my controlling interest to make a personnel decision." "You can't replace us," Ethan said sharply. "We own equal shares." "And I own more than either of you," Richard said calmly. "Effective immediately, Blackwell Technologies will be operating under new leadership. I'm appointing Sophie Mitchell as Chief Executive Officer. Cameron will return to his position as Chief Innovation Officer, and you, Ethan, will step down from operational leadership and move into a consulting role focused exclusively on strategic investment." The silence that followed was absolute. Sophie could hear the air conditioning humming. She could hear traffic from the street far below. She could hear the exact moment when Ethan's control finally, completely shattered. He stood up so quickly his chair nearly toppled backward. His face had gone absolutely white, and his pale blue eyes were filled with something that looked dangerously like betrayal. "You're putting a secretary in charge of this company," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm putting someone with 5 years of institutional knowledge, who understands both of you, and who has no agenda except to make this company succeed in charge of this company," Richard corrected. "The fact that she happened to work as a secretary is irrelevant." "It's not irrelevant," Ethan snapped. "She has no business experience. She managed you for 5 years," Richard interrupted. successfully kept you alive through your various crises, prevented you from destroying your brother during hostile board meetings, and maintained operational efficiency while you two waged corporate warfare. Those are precisely the skills this company needs. Ethan looked at Sophie, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart absolutely break. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something much worse. Disappointment. The kind of disappointment that came when someone you'd trusted turned out to be exactly who you'd suspected they were all along. "If you'll excuse me," he said coldly, "I have consulting to do." He walked out of the boardroom, and Sophie watched him go, knowing with absolute certainty that she'd just made the worst mistake of her life. She'd just become the enemy. Sophie's first day as CEO began at 4:58 in the morning, 12 minutes before her alarm was supposed to go off. She'd been awake since 3 o'clock, staring at the ceiling of her studio apartment, her mind cycling through worst-case scenarios with the efficiency of a particularly anxious computer processor. By 5:30, she was showered, dressed, and standing in front of her bathroom mirror, practicing CEO faces. The stern but fair expression, the confident nod, the "I know what I'm doing even though I'm absolutely terrified" face, which was apparently indistinguishable from the "I'm about to have a nervous breakdown" face. She settled on a charcoal grey suit she'd purchased online at midnight, along with 2 other backup suits and a pair of heels that cost more than she'd ever spent on shoes. Power dressing was a real thing, apparently, and it required actual investment. The Blackwell Tower felt different at 6 o'clock in the morning. Emptier, more cavernous. The kind of place where ghosts of failed business ventures probably lingered in the fluorescent-lit corners. Sophie's heels clicked against the marble floor of the lobby with a sound that screamed, "I don't belong here," which was probably accurate. The executive floor was deserted, except for Derek, the security guard, who gave her a surprised but encouraging nod as she passed. The corner office that had belonged to Ethan, that now belonged to her, was exactly as he'd left it. Obsessively organized. Minimalist. Completely devoid of anything that suggested a human being actually worked there. Sophie stood in the doorway for a full minute, trying to process the fact that this space was now hers, that this responsibility was now hers, that she had absolutely no idea what she was doing. She set her bag down on the desk and immediately moved it because it felt like she was desecrating a temple. Then she sat in the chair, Ethan's chair, her chair now, and felt like a fraud of the highest order. Her computer came to life when she touched it, logging her in automatically through some system she didn't fully understand. Richard had apparently arranged for her accounts to be set up overnight, which was either incredibly efficient or incredibly terrifying, possibly both. There were 372 emails waiting for her. Sophie started reading, and somewhere around email number 47, she began to understand exactly how much was breaking in this company. The Henderson merger disaster had sent shockwaves through every department. Investors were pulling out. The product development timeline had stalled. 3 senior engineers had already submitted their resignations, and the team was fracturing into 2 opposing camps, Team Ethan and Team Cameron, each convinced that their leader was the only one competent enough to save the company. It was, in technical terms, an absolute catastrophe. By 7 o'clock, her phone started buzzing. Text from Cameron. "Dad wants you to know you're doing great. You've been CEO for 1 hour. That's a 100% success rate so far. Don't screw it up." She would have found it funny if she weren't genuinely terrified. At 7:30, her door opened without a knock. A woman in her late 40s, with severe lines around her mouth, and the kind of fashion sense that suggested she'd been wearing the same style of power suit since the 90s, walked in like she owned the place. "Margaret Chen, Chief Financial Officer," the woman said, dropping a folder on Sophie's desk with the care usually reserved for dismantling explosives. "We need to talk about the hemorrhaging of investor capital and what you plan to do about it." Sophie's mouth went dry. "I haven't had time to review all the quarterly statements." No, you haven't, Margaret agreed coldly, because you were a secretary 48 hours ago. Which means you have absolutely no experience managing a multi-billion-dollar technology company. And yet here you are, in a position where your decisions could destroy everything Richard Blackwell spent 30 years building. It was, Sophie thought distantly, going to be one of those days. Sit down, Sophie said, surprising both of them, and walk me through the investor situation. Everything. I'll ask questions when I don't understand something, which will probably be constantly, but at least you'll know that I'm making informed decisions rather than flying blind. Margaret sat, and for the next 2 hours, she delivered what amounted to a corporate funeral sermon. The numbers were bad, worse than bad. The Henderson deal had been worth $80 million, which was supposed to be the anchor investment that would attract others. Without it, confidence in Blackwell Technologies had evaporated like morning dew under a merciless sun. By 9 o'clock, Sophie had a headache that felt like it was attempting to escape through her temples. By 10 o'clock, Cameron had appeared with coffee, looking simultaneously supportive and completely useless. By 11 o'clock, she was on her first of what would be 17 calls with major investors, trying to convince them that, yes, the company was in crisis, but no, that didn't mean the company was dying. It was approximately 11:30 when Ethan walked in without knocking. He was dressed in dark jeans and a Henley shirt, the most casual Sophie had ever seen him outside of video conference calls, where he carefully positioned himself above the camera. His hair was slightly disheveled, and he had the appearance of someone who'd slept approximately 0 hours. But his pale blue eyes, when they locked on hers, were absolutely cutting. "We need to talk," he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested this was not a friendly visit. "I'm in the middle of calls," Sophie said, trying to keep her voice professional and even. "Can this wait?" "No," Ethan said flatly. "It cannot." Sophie gestured to Cameron, who got the message and made himself scarce with the efficiency of someone who'd witnessed sibling conflict before. Once they were alone, Ethan closed the door and walked to the window, his posture rigid. "I want you to understand something," he said, still facing away from her. "When my father told me he was making you CEO, I had a moment where I actually considered leaving the company entirely. Handing over my shares, finding another venture, and never coming back to this building." Sophie's heart sank. This was it, the moment where Ethan formally declared war. "But then I realized something," Ethan continued, turning to face her. "That wouldn't be fair to the 243 people who work here, the people who didn't make catastrophic mistakes, the people who are depending on leadership that actually knows what they're doing. So instead of leaving, I'm going to stay, and I'm going to watch you fail, and I'm going to be here when this company needs actual crisis management. If you're waiting for me to apologize for accepting this position," Sophie started. "I'm not," Ethan interrupted. "I'm telling you that I know what you are. You're ambitious. You saw an opportunity and you took it, and you didn't care who you had to step over to get there. That's fine. That's actually impressive, in a morally questionable way, but don't expect me to pretend that we're anything other than what we are now, professional adversaries. We were never friends," Sophie said quietly. "No," Ethan agreed. "But you made my coffee exactly the way I liked it for 5 years. You kept my schedule organized. You anticipated my needs before I was even aware I had them. And you did all of that while asking for nothing in return, except a paycheck and basic human respect." He moved toward the door. "This version of you, the one who wants power badly enough to betray that trust, I don't know her. And I'm not sure I want to." He left before Sophie could respond, which was probably merciful because she wasn't sure what she would have said anyway. The words felt stuck in her throat, choking her with the weight of his disappointment. The first week as CEO passed in a blur of 16-hour days, emergency meetings, and the slow realization that absolutely nothing in corporate leadership was actually covered by the business podcasts Sophie had been frantically listening to. She implemented a hiring freeze to stem the financial bleeding. She called every major investor personally, not to spin them impressive narratives, but to be honest about the situation and her plan to fix it. She organized all-hands meetings where she admitted that she was in over her head, but that she was committed to learning and, more importantly, to listening to the people who actually knew how the company worked. The team responded surprisingly well. It turned out that people preferred honesty about incompetence to false confidence covering genuine negligence. Who knew? Cameron was an actual dream to work with. He brought her detailed product development reports, introduced her to key personnel, and only occasionally distracted her with stories about the time he'd accidentally ordered 40,000 rubber ducks, thinking they were some kind of specialized equipment component. By day 4, they'd developed a functional working relationship that involved him knowing when to push and when to let her breathe. Ethan was another matter entirely. He would appear at board meetings and offer pointed observations about her decision-making. He would send emails filled with alternative suggestions phrased in language so technically correct and passive-aggressive that they practically glowed with disdain. He would sometimes stand in the hallway near her office, speaking just loudly enough for her to hear conversations about what he would have done differently in a given situation. It was psychological warfare disguised as consulting, and it was absolutely exhausting. By day 6, Sophie had personally prevented 3 investor disasters, reorganized the entire financial reporting structure, and stopped crying in the bathroom for approximately 4 hours. She considered that a win. She was sitting at her desk at 9 o'clock on Friday night, reviewing market projections, when there was a soft knock on her door. "Come in," she said, expecting Cameron and his inevitable attempt to drag her to a bar. Instead, it was Ethan. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, her coffee, she realized with a start. A cappuccino with 2.5 shots of espresso, steamed milk heated to exactly 65 degrees Celsius, 1 centimeter foam, sprinkle of cocoa powder. Her order, not his. "Peace offering," Ethan said, and there was something tentatively uncertain in his expression that she'd never seen before, or at least a flag of temporary truce. Sophie accepted the coffee carefully, like it might explode. "What's this about?" "I watched you for an hour yesterday," Ethan said, sitting down in the chair across from her desk without being invited. "You were on calls with the Riverside investors. You didn't know their product pipeline, but instead of pretending you did, you asked detailed questions about their technical challenges. You listened, actually listened, not the performative listening that most executives do, and then you offered 3 suggestions that would have never occurred to me because they were based on marketing insights rather than engineering perspective." "And?" Sophie prompted. "And I realized something unpleasant," Ethan continued. "You're actually good at this job. Not because you have years of experience, not because you came up through the traditional channels, but because you spent 5 years learning how to manage 2 incompatible personalities simultaneously, and it turns out that's exactly the skill set required to manage a company that's falling apart." Sophie set her coffee down carefully. "I'm still waiting for the but." "But nothing," Ethan said. "No but. I'm here to apologize for being an absolutely terrible colleague this week, and to tell you that you were right about the Henderson situation. If you'd tried to bridge the gap between me and Cameron before everything exploded, you were coming from a good place. I was just too angry to see it." Dean, the thing about Ethan's apologies, Sophie was learning, was that they were so rare and so genuine that they completely upended whatever defensive structure you'd been building around your heart. "I shouldn't have interfered," Sophie said quietly. "That was inappropriate. You were right about that. It was inappropriate, and it was also what this company needed," Ethan said. "Sometimes the right thing is inappropriate. The two aren't mutually exclusive." He paused. "Also, I've been absolutely insufferable this week, and I apologize for that specifically and with genuine remorse." Despite everything, Sophie smiled. "You were insufferable, but I appreciated it actually. It kept me sharp, made me work harder to prove myself." "You didn't need to prove yourself," Ethan said. "You proved yourself the moment you accepted a job that terrifies you and decided to do it anyway." He stood to leave. "For what it's worth, I'm rooting for you. Still going to offer consulting advice you don't want because that's apparently my role in this company now, but I'm rooting for you." After he left, Sophie sat with her cappuccino, still perfectly warm, still exactly right, and tried to process the fact that maybe, possibly, there was a version of this situation where she wasn't the villain in Ethan's story. By the end of week 2, Sophie had implemented a series of strategic changes that actually started to move the needle. She'd renegotiated supplier contracts, freeing up capital that had been locked in inefficient agreements. She'd created a new product development timeline that incorporated Cameron's innovations while still meeting market demand. She'd organized the investor relations department into something resembling actual communications strategy. And somehow, despite all of this, she felt like she was failing at the one thing that actually mattered. She'd asked Cameron about Ethan's consulting role, trying to understand what he was actually supposed to be doing now that he'd been removed from operational leadership. "Strategic investment evaluation," Cameron had said. "So basically, he sits in his office and judges people's business ideas. It's very on brand for him." But Sophie had seen Ethan's face when the team celebrated the new product timeline. She'd noticed how he'd lingered near her office door when she was on calls with engineers. She'd caught the moment in the last board meeting when she'd made a decision that was the opposite of what he would have suggested. And for a split second, his expression had shown something that looked like genuine pride. She was learning that Ethan Blackwell was a man who expressed affection through critique, who showed he cared by pushing you to be better, who would probably never, ever tell her in words that he thought she was doing well, because that would require a level of emotional vulnerability he'd spent his entire life training himself to avoid. Which meant that the cappuccino, the carefully perfect cappuccino brought to her office on Friday night, had probably been the most honest thing he'd said to her in weeks. Sophie was so caught up in this realization that she didn't notice her phone buzzing until it had buzzed approximately 17 times. Texts from Cameron: "Don't come to the office tomorrow. There's something I need to handle. Trust me on this." Followed by, "Actually, you should come to the office tomorrow, but come early, like 5 in the morning, and don't ask questions." Followed by, "Ethan doesn't know I'm doing this. Also, he's going to kill me, but I think it needs to happen." Sophie stared at the texts, trying to decode what "it" referred to, and whether this was Cameron's way of telling her something had broken again. She texted back, "Are we staging an intervention?" Cameron, something like that. "See you at 5 a.m. Bring coffee. Bring a lot of coffee." Sophie arrived at the Blackwell Tower at 4:58 in the morning, which meant she was exactly on schedule according to her paranoid internal clock, and 2 minutes early according to literally everyone else's standards. She was carrying a large insulated bag containing 4 premium cappuccinos from the 24-hour Italian cafe in the Mission District, which was either exactly what Cameron needed or a completely useless gesture, depending on what it turned out to be. The building was completely empty except for the night security team. Derek was on shift, looking mildly surprised to see her at this hour. "Early start?" he asked, not unkindly. "Cameron's orders," Sophie said, which seemed to explain everything. "Has he been here all night?" "Since about 11 o'clock yesterday," Derek confirmed. "He's in the conference room on the executive floor. Also, Mr. Ethan arrived about 30 minutes ago, which suggests he either couldn't sleep or he figured out something was happening." Sophie's stomach clenched. Cameron hadn't mentioned anything about Ethan knowing. In fact, the text had specifically stated that Ethan didn't know, which either meant that Ethan had figured it out independently, or Cameron had lied, or the situation had somehow spiraled into territory Sophie couldn't even predict. She took the elevator up with a sense of impending doom that was becoming increasingly familiar. The conference room was visible from the hallway through the glass walls, a completely transparent space designed by someone who clearly didn't understand the concept of privacy in tense situations. Cameron was there, standing in front of a massive whiteboard covered in what appeared to be architectural sketches and financial projections. Ethan was there too, standing rigidly near the window, his pale blue eyes absolutely glacial. Sophie took a breath and walked in. "Good morning," she said carefully, setting the coffee bag on the conference table. "Cameron, I assume there's a reason you've summoned me to what appears to be a crime scene involving a whiteboard." "It's not a crime scene," Cameron said, which was technically true, but also weirdly evasive. "It's an opportunity, a really good one, the kind that could actually save this company." "I thought we were already saving the company," Sophie said, looking at Ethan to see if he had any insight into what his brother was talking about. Ethan just looked like he wanted to commit a felony. "We are," Cameron continued, moving to the whiteboard with the enthusiasm of someone about to pitch the most terrible idea he'd ever had. "But we're doing it small, incrementally, competently, and boring as absolute hell. What if instead we did something big? Something that actually repositioned Blackwell Technologies as an industry leader instead of just a company that's managed to avoid bankruptcy." He pointed to the sketches on the whiteboard, which Sophie gradually recognized as architectural renderings of what appeared to be a massive technology campus. "The Costa Montagna site," Cameron said, and Sophie felt her brain short-circuit. 42 acres of underdeveloped land, about 40 miles south of here. It's been on the market for 18 months because the previous buyer's financing fell through, and it's currently available for approximately $220 million. "No," Ethan said flatly. "Absolutely not." "Do hear me out," Cameron said quickly, in the tone of someone who knew he was about to be rejected and wanted to get his entire pitch in before that happened. "Right now, we're renting office space across multiple buildings. We're paying millions per year in lease agreements, splitting our team across different locations, reducing efficiency. What if we consolidated? What if we built our own campus, luxury facilities, on-site housing, top-tier amenities that would make every engineer in Silicon Valley want to work for us?" "We don't have $220 million, Sophie said slowly. "We're still recovering from the Henderson disaster. Our investor confidence is fragile at best." "Not with the right pitch," Cameron said. "Not if we present it as a visionary move instead of a desperate gamble. Richard agrees with me. He thinks it's exactly the kind of ambitious project that could actually turn this company's narrative around." Sophie felt Ethan's eyes on her, watching to see how she would react to this information. This was a test of some kind. She could feel it in the weight of his gaze. "You've already discussed this with Richard," Sophie said, not as a question. "This wasn't a surprise to either of you." "It wasn't," Cameron admitted. "Dad thinks it's brilliant. Ethan thinks it's financial suicide." "It is financial suicide," Ethan said coldly. "We don't have the capital. We don't have the expertise to manage a project of this scale. And we certainly don't have the luxury of making mistakes of this magnitude." "We could," Cameron said, "if we had someone who could actually manage it. Someone who isn't emotionally invested in either the conservative or the risk-taking approach. Someone who could evaluate this objectively and determine if it's viable." He was looking at Sophie when he said it. "No," Sophie said immediately. "I'm not approving this. It's too risky." "You haven't even looked at the financial models," Cameron protested. "I don't need to," Sophie said. "I know exactly what they say. They say that if everything goes perfectly and everything never goes perfectly, we'd break even in 7 years. And if anything goes wrong, we'd be in a debt situation that would make the Henderson disaster look like a rounding error." "So that's no," Ethan said, and there was something in his tone that might have been relief. "That's no," Sophie confirmed. "Cameron, I appreciate the vision. I really do. But my job is to keep this company stable, not to bankrupt it on a gamble, no matter how attractive the potential payoff might be. Cameron's face fell, and Sophie felt genuinely terrible about it. But she also felt absolutely certain in her decision, which was either confidence or stubbornness, wearing a confidence costume. "What if I told you that Richard already bought the property?" Cameron said quietly. The room went completely still. "He didn't," Sophie said, but there was a question in her voice now. "He did," Cameron confirmed. "Last week, privately through a shell corporation so it wouldn't show up on Blackwell Technologies' books. He's holding it as an investment and offering it to the company at cost if we commit to the development. That's," Sophie searched for the right word, "that's an interesting way to bypass corporate governance." "It's his property," Cameron said defensively. "He can do what he wants with it." "But he's offering it to us," Ethan said slowly, his mind visibly working through the implications. "Which means he's expecting us to accept, which means this was never actually a proposal. It was a done deal that Cameron's been sent to sell us on. He wants both of you involved in the decision," Cameron said. "But he thought Sophie should evaluate it objectively, as the CEO, without the emotional baggage you two carry about ambition and risk and whatever psychological wounds are driving this entire sibling dynamic." "Did Richard actually say psychological wounds?" Sophie asked, which wasn't the important question, but was definitely the funny one. "He said complicated relationship patterns," Cameron corrected. "But same energy." Sophie walked to the whiteboard and actually looked at the renderings for the first time. Costa Montagna was a beautiful location, rolling hills, accessible but not too close to the urban sprawl. The campus design was incredible. Whoever had created it understood something fundamental about how creative people needed to work. There were collaboration spaces that didn't feel sterile, outdoor areas, natural light, the kind of environment that probably cost millions to design correctly. "If we did this," Sophie said slowly, "who would manage the project?" "That would be the problem," Ethan said dryly. "Cameron wants it. I think it's irresponsible, and neither of us are particularly suited to project management at this scale." "You would hire a project manager," Sophie said, "someone with expertise in technology campus development, someone who could oversee construction, manage the timeline, handle the complexities of bringing something this large to life." "Obviously," Ethan said. "Which would cost additional capital we don't have." Sophie stood in the silence of the conference room, with two brothers watching her and a massive decision hanging in the air like a sword, and realized something important. She was terrified, not of the decision itself, of what the decision would say about her as a CEO, as a leader. If she said yes, she would be gambling the company on Richard's conviction and Cameron's vision. She would be betting that sometimes the best way to survive is to grow, not shrink. She would be betting on ambition. If she said no, she would be playing it safe. She would be doing the responsible thing, the thing everyone would understand and approve of, the thing that would probably bore the company into irrelevance over the next 5 to 10 years as smaller, more ambitious competitors ate their market share. "I need more information," Sophie said finally. "Not assumptions, data. I need to see the full financial models, the construction timeline, the risk assessments. I need to talk to project management specialists about feasibility. And I need to do this without Cameron trying to convince me with enthusiasm and Ethan trying to convince me with fear. Can you do that?" "Yes," Cameron said immediately. "That's excessive due diligence," Ethan said. "We don't have time." "We have exactly as much time as I decide we have," Sophie said, and she was surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "This is my decision to make, and I'm going to make it after I've actually evaluated all the relevant information." Cameron looked relieved. Ethan looked like he wanted to argue but recognized that Sophie had firmly closed that door. "There's one more thing," Cameron said carefully. "Richard wants you two to work together on this evaluation. He thinks that if you're forced to actually collaborate, instead of trying to sabotage each other, you might figure out that you're not actually incompatible. You're just incompletely communicating. Sophie and Ethan both turned to stare at Cameron with the unified fury of two people who'd just realized they'd been set up. "No," Ethan said. "Absolutely not," Sophie said. "Too bad," Cameron said cheerfully. "He already arranged it. You have a dinner reservation tonight at Atelier Lumière, 7 o'clock. Non-negotiable. He said if either of you cancels, he's going to personally call every major investor and tell them about the time Ethan spent 2 hours trying to teach an algorithm to appreciate modern art, or the time Sophie filed 17 separate expense reports because she was too polite to ask for clearer categorization guidelines. That's blackmail, Sophie said. That's family, Cameron corrected. Good luck. He left before either of them could protest further, his footsteps echoing down the hallway with the speed of someone escaping a scene he'd orchestrated and then decided he really didn't want to witness. Sophie and Ethan stood in the conference room surrounded by sketches of a campus that might bankrupt them or might save them, faced with the realization that Richard Blackwell was apparently running an elaborate scheme to force them into proximity. "We're not going," Ethan said finally. "We have to," Sophie replied. "If we don't, he's going to call every investor and tell them about your algorithmic art project." "He would never," Ethan said. "That's completely improbable." "Is it, though?" Sophie asked. "Is it really?" Ethan's expression suggested he was reconsidering his father's capacity for psychological warfare. "This is manipulation," Ethan said. "It is," Sophie agreed. "But it's also your father's way of saying that he doesn't think we're actually enemies, that he thinks we could work together if we bothered to actually talk to each other like human beings instead of corporate adversaries." "I don't want to work together," Ethan said, but there was no conviction in it. "I'm aware," Sophie said, "but you're going to dinner anyway, because backing out would mean admitting that you're afraid." "I'm not afraid," Ethan said. "Then meet me at Atelier Lumière at 7 o'clock, Sophie said. "And we can have an awkward dinner while we pretend to evaluate a campus project, and we can both go home angry about the fact that Richard orchestrated this entire situation." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The cappuccino was Richard's idea too, wasn't it? The one I brought you on Friday." "Probably," Sophie admitted. "Or possibly Cameron. They seem to be working together on this elaborate plan to force us into some kind of reconciliation." "It's working," Ethan said quietly, "which I hate." "I know," Sophie said, and she did know. She could see it in the way his shoulders had slightly relaxed, in the way his pale blue eyes were looking at her with something other than anger for the first time in weeks. 7 o'clock, Ethan said. "Atelier Lumière. I'll be there." "Don't be late," Sophie said, which was possibly the most normal thing she'd said to him since becoming CEO. Richard sounds like the type of person who would definitely call investors about algorithmic art if you're late. Sophie spent the rest of the day in a state of productive anxiety, which meant she accomplished approximately 14 different tasks, while her brain was entirely focused on the fact that she had a dinner reservation with Ethan Blackwell at an upscale restaurant that had a 3-month waiting list. She texted Cameron, "Your father is evil. Has anyone told him this?" Cameron responded immediately, "Dad prefers visionary. Also, he told me to tell you that you look nice in literally anything, but that the navy dress with the small white buttons would probably make Ethan have feelings about professionalism." Sophie, "Why would he care what Ethan feels about my dress?" Cameron, "I think that's the part he's trying to get you to figure out on your own, but from his tone of voice, I'm pretty sure it has to do with Ethan having suppressed romantic feelings that he's been channeling into corporate hostility." Sophie, "That's insane." Cameron, "Completely insane, which is why it's probably accurate. See you later. Wear the dress. Trust me." Sophie did not trust Cameron, but she did, at approximately 5 o'clock that evening, find herself in her tiny studio apartment trying on the navy dress with the small white buttons. and she did acknowledge that it fit well, and that she looked objectively put together in a way that suggested she was a functional human being, rather than someone who'd been working 70-hour weeks. She arrived at Atelier Lumière at 6:54, which gave her approximately 60 seconds to panic about the entire situation before Ethan appeared. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit with a white shirt and a tie in a shade of blue that was almost exactly the color of his eyes, which was either a coincidence or something Richard had also orchestrated. Given the current track record, Sophie would have placed money on orchestration. "You're here," Ethan said, as if he'd half expected her to cancel at the last second. "I'm here," Sophie confirmed, "and I'm going to evaluate your father's campus project while maintaining strict professional boundaries." "Of course," Ethan said, "that's exactly what we're going to do." But when the hostess led them to their table, a small, intimate corner booth with a view of the San Francisco lights, and when their server arrived with wine Ethan hadn't ordered and appetizers he definitely hadn't requested, they both understood that Richard had orchestrated the evening down to the molecular level. "Your father is subtle," Sophie said dryly, looking at the tasting menu that had apparently been pre-selected. "He's the opposite of subtle," Ethan corrected. "He's relentlessly obvious about his manipulation. It's actually a power move. He doesn't bother hiding it because he knows no one will stop him." They ate their way through a 7-course tasting menu that Richard had apparently designed to be conversation-conducive, which meant dishes that required discussion of flavors and techniques rather than awkward silences. And somewhere between the 2nd course and the 3rd, something shifted. It might have been the wine. It might have been the fact that Sophie was genuinely exhausted and no longer had the energy to maintain hostile professionalism. It might have been that Ethan, faced with an evening he couldn't escape, decided to stop fighting his father's agenda and just talk to her. "I've been unfair," he said quietly during the 4th course. "These past few weeks. I've been treating you like you took something from me when really you just accepted an opportunity. That's not a character flaw, that's ambition, and I respect ambition." "You've been difficult," Sophie agreed, "but not unfair. You were protecting something you cared about, the company, your family legacy. That's not villainous." "It felt a little villainous," Ethan said. "It felt like I was trying to sabotage you the way I felt like you'd sabotaged me." "Did I sabotage you?" Sophie asked. "Looking back, I don't think that's what happened. I think I was trying to help, and it went catastrophically wrong. And then your father used the chaos to force a decision that he'd probably wanted to make for a long time." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're very good at this job, by the way. At being CEO, I should have said that earlier." Something in Sophie's chest clenched. "Thank you." "You're not grateful," Ethan observed. "You're uncomfortable. Why?" "Because I want you to think I'm good at my job for the right reasons," Sophie said, surprising herself with her honesty. "Not because I'm proving something or because I got lucky. I want you to actually believe I earned this." "You did earn it," Ethan said. "You've earned it every single day since you accepted the position. You've made difficult decisions with incomplete information. You've admitted when you don't know something. You've actually listened to people instead of just waiting for your turn to talk. Those are the skills that actually matter in leadership, and you have them in abundance." He said it so simply, so genuinely, that Sophie felt her eyes getting suspiciously warm. "The Costa Montagna project," she said, changing the subject before she did something embarrassing like cry in an upscale restaurant. "What's your honest assessment? Not the fearful version, not the protective version. Your actual genuine assessment of whether it's a viable investment." Ethan set down his fork and considered the question with the kind of seriousness it deserved. "It's risky," he said finally. "More risky than I'm comfortable with. But it's also visionary in exactly the way Cameron said it is. Right now, we're a company that survived a disaster. We're small and scrappy and clever. But we're not influential. We're not the kind of company that sets industry standards. A campus like Costa Montagna could change that. It could position us as a company that's thinking about the future, not just about quarterly earnings. It could attract talent that's currently going to Google and Apple and Microsoft. Would you do it? Sophie asked. If you were CEO? No, Ethan said. I would be too afraid of the downside. But I'm also someone who's risk-averse by nature, and that's limited me in a lot of ways professionally. So the fact that I wouldn't do it doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that maybe having someone else make the decision is exactly what this company needs. Sophie absorbed this, understanding that it was possibly the closest Ethan had ever come to saying that her leadership might be better suited to some situations than his would be. I'm going to approve it, she said. The Costa Montagna project. I'm going to hire a project management firm, and I'm going to establish strict oversight and contingency plans. But I'm going to do it. Ethan's expression shifted. Surprise, then something that might have been pride, then something harder to identify that looked suspiciously like admiration. Your call, he said, but I think it's the right one. They finished dinner without returning to the awkward territory they'd been occupying. Instead, they fell into something that resembled actual conversation, the kind where you're genuinely interested in what the other person has to say, and where you're willing to be honest about your own vulnerabilities. When the check came, which neither of them had requested, and which was obviously another Richard move, Ethan insisted on paying, and Sophie let him because fighting about it would have broken whatever fragile peace they'd established. As they walked out of the restaurant into the San Francisco night, Ethan said, "Thank you for coming. I know this was your father's manipulation, but I'm grateful that you showed up anyway." "Thank you for actually talking to me," Sophie replied, "instead of using words as weapons, which is more your style." "I'm working on that," Ethan said. "Expressing myself through something other than critical analysis and passive-aggressive consulting suggestions." "You're doing well," Sophie said. There was a moment, just a brief one, where they stood on the sidewalk outside an upscale restaurant, and the city lights made everything feel slightly surreal. And Sophie thought that Ethan might be about to do something that would fundamentally change their professional relationship. Instead, he stepped back and said, "I'll see you on Monday. We should probably schedule a meeting to discuss the Costa Montagna evaluation parameters and establish a timeline." "Professional," Sophie said, with only slight disappointment. "Professional," Ethan agreed. "For now." The Costa Montagna project consumed the next 6 weeks like a living thing, demanding time, energy and resources in quantities that Sophie had previously thought theoretical. She'd hired a project management firm, Castellano and Associates, specialists in technology campus development, and their lead, a brilliant but exhaustingly thorough woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, had created a timeline that made the previous company deadlines look like gentle suggestions. Construction would begin in 8 weeks. Funding needed to be secured in 4 weeks. Environmental assessments, municipal permits, and architectural finalizations needed to happen simultaneously. It was, in technical terms, a logistical nightmare that somehow also felt possible in a way Sophie was beginning to recognize as the difference between competent planning and desperate hope. She'd also, and this was the part that made her genuinely nervous, established a collaboration structure that put her and Ethan in the same meetings approximately 4 times per week. It had seemed like a good idea on paper. Ethan understood the technical infrastructure requirements better than anyone else in the company. Sophie understood the business implications and financial constraints. Together they could make decisions that neither of them could make alone. It was strategic, it was logical, it was also slowly driving Sophie insane, because working in close proximity with Ethan Blackwell while maintaining strict professional boundaries was approximately as easy as ignoring an active fire alarm, while it was literally screaming in your ear. The server architecture for the development campus needs to be redundant across 3 separate nodes, Ethan said on a Wednesday afternoon, during what was supposed to be a 30-minute check-in and had already stretched into 90 minutes. We can't risk a single point of failure on a campus this size. We'd be looking at approximately 18 million in additional infrastructure costs, but we don't have 18 million in additional costs, Sophie said, trying not to sound frustrated and definitely failing. We're already 3 million over budget on site preparation, and we haven't even broken ground yet. Then we find 18 million, Ethan said, with the kind of unshakable certainty that came from never having had to actually balance a budget. We find it because the alternative is building a technology campus with infrastructure that's inadequate. That's not acceptable. Acceptable is currently not on the menu, Sophie said, standing up and moving to the whiteboard where they'd been tracking financial allocations. We're choosing between inadequate and bankrupt. I'm going with inadequate, and we're making it work through clever engineering and strategic redundancy that doesn't cost $18 million. That won't work, Ethan said flatly. Then we'll make something that will, Sophie replied. Ethan, I need you to think like an engineer who has budget constraints instead of like someone designing a theoretical perfect system. What's the minimum viable infrastructure? What can we implement now and upgrade later? He was quiet for a long moment, his pale blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with server architecture and everything to do with the fact that they were standing approximately 2 feet apart, and Sophie was acutely aware of every single way that distance was both too close and not nearly close enough. You're right, he said finally. I'm designing for perfection when we should be designing for functionality. A phased approach, basic infrastructure now, upgrades as revenue permits. We could implement it over 3 years without compromising performance. Thank you, Sophie said, which was the wrong thing to say because saying thank you implied that Ethan had done something difficult for her, which implied that she cared about him doing things, which implied feelings that she absolutely could not afford to have about the man she was currently in a competitive professional relationship with. Don't thank me, Ethan said quietly. You're just forcing me to think more clearly. That's not a favor, that's leadership. He walked to the window. He seemed to have a habit of doing this when conversations became emotionally complicated, and stood with his hands in his pockets, his silhouette sharp against the San Francisco skyline. I think we should talk about what's happening, he said, still facing away from her. What's happening is we're trying to build a technology campus on a budget that would make most people weep, Sophie said, buying time. That's not what I mean, Ethan said, and you know it. Sophie did know it. She'd been aware of it for approximately 3 weeks, ever since dinner at Atelier Lumière had revealed that underneath the professional armor there was a version of Ethan who was capable of actual human connection. A version that looked at her like she mattered, like her opinions mattered, like she mattered in a way that had nothing to do with corporate strategy or administrative efficiency. We can't talk about what's happening, Sophie said carefully, because what's happening is professional complicated, and acknowledging it would make the professional part significantly worse. What if the professional part is less important than the other part? Ethan asked. Sophie's heart, which had apparently been waiting for permission to engage in complete cardiac rebellion, did something dramatic and irregular in her chest. It's not, she said firmly. The professional part is the only part that actually matters right now. You're still adjusting to not being in operational leadership. I'm still proving that I can actually do this job. And we're building a $220 million campus that could either save this company or destroy it. Those are not the conditions under which we can complicate things by acknowledging that there's attraction. Ethan supplied helpfully. It's called attraction, Sophie, and pretending it doesn't exist doesn't actually make it stop existing. It just makes working together this closely increasingly difficult, which is why we should continue pretending, Sophie said, moving back to the whiteboard and deliberately focusing on the financial spreadsheet rather than looking at him. Until after Costa Montagna is built and operating successfully, then, if we still feel the same way, we can address it. You think you'll feel differently after Costa Montagna is built? Ethan asked. I'm counting on it, Sophie admitted. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, That's not how feelings work. I know, Sophie said, but it's the only way I know how to survive the next year without completely destroying my professional credibility. He left shortly after, and Sophie sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by architectural renderings and financial spreadsheets, trying to convince herself that she'd made the right decision, and mostly failing. By week 4 of the Costa Montagna project, funding had been secured through a combination of venture capital investment and Richard Blackwell's personal injection of capital, a move that suggested he believed entirely in the vision and was willing to personally guarantee its success. The municipal permits were approved, the environmental assessments had been cleared. Dr. Elena Vasquez had begun preliminary site preparation, and the countdown to actual construction had begun in earnest. Sophie had moved into a state of functioning exhaustion that required approximately 7 cups of coffee per day and a strict schedule of meditation apps that she didn't have time to actually listen to, but appreciated the concept of. She was sleeping an average of 4 hours per night, which was apparently sustainable if you combined it with an aggressive commitment to not thinking about Ethan Blackwell and his pale blue eyes, and the way he said her name like he was testing the weight of it. The team was running at maximum efficiency. Every decision had to be made quickly but carefully. Every department was contributing to the larger vision, and Cameron had somehow become the emotional anchor of the entire operation, frequently appearing with coffee and the exact kind of joke that made the stress temporarily feel manageable. It was during the 4th week that Sophie discovered the first major problem. She was reviewing the construction timeline with Dr. Vasquez when Elena mentioned casually that they were dealing with some unexpected soil composition variations that might require adjusted foundation specifications. How adjusted? Sophie asked, in the tone of someone who'd learned that small problems had a habit of snowballing into catastrophic ones. We'll need to do additional testing, Eleanor said carefully. Possibly modify the foundation design for the central administrative building. It's probably nothing serious, but we need to rule out some structural concerns before we proceed with major construction. How much delay? Sophie asked. 2 weeks, possibly 3. Sophie felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. 2 to 3 weeks didn't sound catastrophic until you understood that Blackwell Technologies' entire investor confidence was built on delivering on timeline. Investors wanted evidence that the company could execute. A delay this early in the project would be read as incompetence, as underestimation, as early signs that maybe this whole thing was a mistake. She scheduled an emergency meeting with the executive team for 6 o'clock that evening. Ethan arrived before Sophie did, which was unusual enough to suggest he'd been expecting the meeting. He was carrying his laptop and the expression of someone preparing for bad news, which meant Cameron had probably given him a heads up. Cameron arrived with actual concern on his face. Richard called in via video conference, and Dr. Elena Vasquez joined remotely from the construction site. Sophie laid out the problem without embellishment. The soil composition issues, the foundation concerns, the 2 to 3 week delay, the implications for investor confidence. The silence that followed was the kind that suggested everyone was mentally calculating how this might destroy them. We need to manage the narrative, Richard said from the screen. This isn't a failure. This is due diligence. Any competent project manager identifies structural concerns before they become expensive problems. We leak this to the right journalists and we look proactive instead of reactive. We also need to fix the problem, Ethan said, which was the pragmatic observation that nobody else wanted to voice. The foundation specification adjustment. What does that look like, Elena? For the next 40 minutes, they discussed engineering solutions. The soil composition appeared to be more clay-heavy than the initial geological surveys had suggested, which meant the foundation would need to be adjusted to account for differential settling rates. The central administrative building might require pilings deeper than originally planned. The cost adjustment was estimated at somewhere between $1.2 and $1.8 million. We absorb it, Sophie said, and everyone turned to look at her. You're not going to negotiate? Cameron asked, surprised. With who? Sophie said. The Earth? The budget is the budget. We either find the money or we cut elsewhere. What can we reduce without compromising the campus vision? The employee residency component, Ethan said immediately. We could eliminate the residential housing initially, implement it as a phase 2. That would save approximately $3.2 million and wouldn't compromise the core campus functionality. Except housing was a major selling point for talent recruitment, Cameron protested. That's supposed to be our differentiator, the ability to attract engineers who want to live and work in the same location. Then we implement a modified housing component, Sophie said. Not full residential capacity. Maybe 20% capacity, prioritized for out-of-state hires. We can position it as building community incrementally instead of all at once. It's not a bad thing narratively. She was already moving through the implications in her head. 20% housing on-site reduced the infrastructure load. It allowed them to maintain the core concept without the full financial commitment. It was a compromise that acknowledged reality without sacrificing vision. That's actually brilliant, Elena said from the remote connection. It reduces the load on systems I'm worried about anyway. You just gave me a better project design while also solving your budget problem. The meeting continued for another hour, and by the end of it, they had a plan. They had a way forward. They had something that felt like control, which was approximately 80% illusion, but 10% worth the feeling. As people filtered out, Ethan stayed behind. You're doing this, he said quietly. You're actually doing it. You're building the campus. You're absorbing the complications. You're leading. I'm terrified, Sophie said, which was a more honest response than she generally allowed herself to give. That delay could have destroyed everything. And we don't even know if the foundation modifications will actually solve the problem. They will, Ethan said. And even if they don't, you'll figure it out. That's what you do. He moved closer, and Sophie's every rational thought seemed to evaporate like water on a hot surface. We need to keep maintaining professional boundaries, she said, but her voice was unconvincing even to her own ears. We do, Ethan agreed. I know. But Sophie, I need you to understand something. I'm proud of you. Not because you're doing your job. Because you're doing something that most people would consider impossible, and you're doing it while managing people like me and Cameron, who are actively making it harder. That's extraordinary. Sophie felt her eyes getting warm again, which was happening with uncomfortable frequency lately. You should go home, she said. It's late. You need rest. You need rest, Ethan countered. When's the last time you actually slept a full night? I don't remember, Sophie admitted. Sometime in the previous century. Go home, Ethan said, moving toward the door. Sleep. Let your brain rest. Costa Montagna isn't going anywhere. He left, and Sophie sat alone in the conference room again, surrounded by architectural renderings and the awareness that she was slowly, inexorably falling in love with Ethan Blackwell, and that she couldn't do anything about it without destroying everything they were trying to build. By week 7 of the Costa Montagna project, the construction had actually begun. Heavy equipment moved across the Costa Montagna site in carefully orchestrated patterns. Piles were driven into the ground to depths the modified foundation design required. The central administrative building footprint began to take shape. Sophie had visited the site 6 times, each time with Dr. Elena Vasquez walking her through the progress and the challenges and the ways that everything was somehow both on schedule and perpetually behind. The company culture had shifted. Instead of existing in states of tension and rivalry, people had something unified to work toward. Engineers were collaborating across departments. The design team was integrating feedback from operations and finance. Sophie had instituted weekly all-hands meetings where she provided transparent updates about the timeline, the budget, and the inevitable problems that arose. The team responded to honesty. They responded to leadership that acknowledged complexity instead of pretending everything was fine. They responded to a CEO who admitted when she didn't know something, but committed to finding the answer. And somewhere in the middle of all this, the boundary between professional respect and personal feeling had become increasingly blurred for Sophie and Ethan. He would appear in her office with updates about infrastructure design. He would send her lengthy emails about technical considerations that could have been covered in 5 minutes of conversation. He would attend her Friday evening meetings about budget allocation with a focus that suggested he cared about the budget allocations rather than just being interested in spending time in the same room as her. They maintained professional distance in public, but in private meetings, the tension had become almost visible, something you could feel settling in the air between them like atmospheric pressure before a storm. It was during week 7 that things finally broke. Sophie was in the campus model room, a physical scale model of Costa Montagna that showed the buildings in their completed state, the landscape features, the vision of what the space would eventually become. She was studying the residential component, trying to think through how to expand it in Phase 2 without compromising the core campus infrastructure when Ethan appeared in the doorway. "You're here late," he said. It was 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening, and the building was largely empty. "The residential component needs optimization," Sophie said, not looking at him, because looking at him had become increasingly dangerous to her professional focus. "We're going to need to expand it in Phase 2, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't overload the water and electrical systems. I'm trying to figure out if a phased residential expansion is actually logistically possible." "It is," Ethan said, moving into the room and standing across the model from her, "but not if you try to do it sequentially. You need to build out the infrastructure for full capacity in Phase 1, then populate it gradually in Phases 2 and 3. That doubles the infrastructure cost," Sophie said, "which we can absorb from operational savings once the campus is complete. And we've consolidated our scattered office locations," Ethan pointed out. "It's a short-term expense that pays for itself over time." Sophie finally looked at him and immediately regretted it because he was looking at her with that particular intensity that made thinking about infrastructure costs nearly impossible. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Because you're here," Ethan said simply, "and because we need to stop pretending that we're not." "Pretending not to what?" Sophie asked, even though she absolutely knew what. "That we're attracted to each other," Ethan said. "That working this closely is making it increasingly difficult to maintain professional distance. That I think about you constantly when I should be thinking about infrastructure design. That you probably think about me too, and you're trying very hard not to, because you're trying to be responsible and not complicate an already complicated situation." "You're right," Sophie said quietly. "I do think about you. And I'm trying not to complicate things, because we still have a campus to build, and anything that happens between us would make that exponentially harder." "Would it, though?" Ethan asked. "Or would it actually make the work easier? Because right now, we're both operating at about 60% efficiency because we're using 40% of our mental energy on maintaining distance. What if we stop doing that?" "We can't," Sophie said, but it sounded like she was trying to convince herself. "Ethan, I'm your CEO. That's an enormous power imbalance. If anything happened between us and it ended badly, it would damage both of us professionally. I know, Ethan said, which is why I'm going to step back from operations entirely. Not leave the company, but move fully into the consulting role. No direct reports, no conflict of interest. I'll advise on infrastructure and strategic decisions, but I won't be part of the organizational hierarchy. You'd do that? Sophie asked, surprised. I'd do that, and about 100 other things if it meant we could stop pretending, Ethan said. Sophie, I've spent 5 years watching you manage my brother and me while asking for nothing except basic respect. I've spent the past 2 months watching you build something impossible from a position of uncertainty. I am profoundly attracted to your competence, your integrity, and the way you think through problems like you're conducting a symphony. And I want to see what happens between us when we're not forcing ourselves to maintain distance. Sophie's heart was doing something that was probably medically concerning at this point. Her mind was cycling through all the reasons this was a terrible idea, and her body was apparently staging a coup because she found herself moving toward him instead of away from him. If we do this, she said carefully, we do it carefully. No public displays. No complications until after the campus is operational. No drama that could affect the team. Agreed, Ethan said. And we maintain professional boundaries in the office, Sophie continued. No one needs to know that anything has changed. Agreed, Ethan said again. And if it doesn't work out, Sophie said, the most important condition, we end it cleanly and professionally without destroying the company. Agreed, Ethan said a third time. Now are you going to keep negotiating the terms of this situation, or are you going to let me do something I've been wanting to do for approximately 6 weeks? Sophie didn't answer. Instead, she closed the distance between them and discovered that kissing Ethan Blackwell was approximately 1,000 times better than she'd theoretically imagined, which was a problem because she'd been theoretically imagining it quite a bit. He was careful at first, like he was testing whether this was actually happening or if she was going to suddenly change her mind and revert to corporate formality. But when Sophie deepened the kiss and pulled him closer, he stopped being careful and just kissed her like someone who'd been waiting a very long time for permission. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie was breathless, and Ethan looked like someone who'd just figured out the solution to a problem he'd been working on for months. That was, Sophie said, still trying to process what had just happened, incredibly inadvisable from a professional standpoint. It was, Ethan agreed. I regret it not at all. We're going to regret this, Sophie said. Probably, Ethan said, but not right now. He kissed her again, and Sophie made the conscious decision to stop thinking about professional implications and just allow herself to exist in a moment where she was a woman being kissed by someone she cared about, in a room full of models of an impossible campus they were somehow actually building together. It was, she thought distantly, possibly the best mistake she'd ever made. The Costa Montagna campus opened on a Tuesday morning in late September, exactly 14 months and 2 weeks after Sophie had accidentally destroyed a merger and changed her entire life in the process. The weather was perfect in the way that only Northern California weather could be perfect. Blue skies, so bright they almost hurt to look at. A gentle breeze that carried the scent of eucalyptus and possibility, and the kind of light that made everything look slightly golden and slightly surreal. Sophie stood in the administrative building's main atrium, looking up at the soaring ceilings and the skylights that Dr. Elena Vasquez had insisted upon despite Ethan's concerns about glare and energy efficiency, and felt something in her chest that she could only describe as pride mixed with disbelief, mixed with the lingering fear that something was about to go catastrophically wrong. Nothing had gone catastrophically wrong. Somehow, against odds that had seemed astronomical at various points during the construction process, the campus was complete. The foundation had held. The soil composition had cooperated with the modified design. The budget had remained not exactly under control, but within the realm of acceptability. and the team had delivered something extraordinary. "You built this," Cameron said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee from what was apparently the world's finest on-campus cafe. "You actually built this. I have to say, I doubted you at certain points." "You doubted me constantly," Sophie corrected, accepting the coffee. "You just did it in a supportive way." "That's because I'm an emotionally evolved human being," Cameron said. "Unlike certain brothers I could mention who express their feelings through infrastructure optimization." Sophie smiled despite her general state of nervous exhaustion. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours in approximately 6 months. She'd lost 12 pounds that she probably should have lost anyway, but would have preferred to lose in ways that didn't involve living on coffee and anxiety. She'd made approximately 17,000 decisions, most of them consequential, and somehow approximately 97% of them had turned out to be correct. The campus was operating at capacity. All 243 existing employees had been relocated to Costa Montana. The new hiring program had filled the residency component to the planned 20% capacity, with carefully selected talent that was already transforming the culture. The infrastructure was humming along with the kind of efficiency that made Ethan's eyes light up in ways that had nothing to do with his complicated feelings about Sophie and everything to do with his genuine love for well-designed systems. About those complicated feelings, Sophie and Ethan had managed to maintain the professional boundaries they'd established while simultaneously becoming significantly more complicated in their private moments. They were careful, they were discreet, and they were also desperately in love in a way that felt fragile and enormous all at once. The logistics were difficult. Ethan had formally stepped back into a consulting role, which meant he no longer had direct authority over any departments, but was somehow involved in nearly every significant decision. Sophie maintained the CEO position with the kind of focus that suggested she'd been born to lead and had simply been waiting for her life circumstances to catch up. And between the official roles and the professional masks, they'd found pockets of time where they could just be 2 people who cared about each other instead of 2 executives managing an empire. "Ethan's already here," Cameron continued, handing her a second coffee. "He's in the server room, doing some final configuration adjustments, and probably humming to himself about optimal performance parameters. He gets weird when infrastructure is perfect." "He does," Sophie agreed, trying not to think about the fact that Ethan was in the building and that they wouldn't be able to acknowledge each other beyond professional courtesy in public. "Is Richard here?" "And on his way," Cameron said. "He's bringing journalists. Apparently, the campus opening is actually newsworthy. Visionary real estate development, massive tech sector investment, American dream narrative, the whole package." Sophie felt her stomach do an anxious flip. The media presence meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant that someone might eventually put together the pieces of the story. The secretary who became CEO, the romantic tension between the CEO and the consultant, the family drama that had preceded it all. The press loved narratives like that. They could turn something private into something public very quickly. "You're nervous," Cameron observed. "I'm terrified," Sophie said honestly. "What if someone asks about the relationship dynamic between me and Ethan? Then you say that you respect him as a consultant and a strategic thinker," Cameron said. "Which is true, and you don't offer any additional information because that's not how professional people operate. Sophie, you've managed 2 billionaire brothers, navigated corporate warfare, and built a $220 million campus. You can absolutely handle a few journalists." He was right. Sophie knew he was right. But the fear persisted anyway because the stakes felt higher now, not because of the company or the campus or the financial implications. Because of Ethan, and the fact that what they had was still so new and so uncertain that the thought of it becoming public felt like it might break something. The opening ceremony was, despite Sophie's considerable anxiety, Exactly what a tech campus opening should be. There were speeches about innovation and vision and the future of work. There were tours of the facilities that made visiting journalists actually sound impressed. There was a casual mention of how the campus had been built ahead of schedule and under budget, which Cameron had somehow managed to make true through a combination of aggressive cost management and strategic use of remaining contingency funds. And there was, inevitably, a moment where a journalist from the San Francisco Chronicle asked about the CEO's background. "Ms. Mitchell, your path to the CEO position is somewhat unconventional," the journalist said. "A woman named Patricia, who had the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she'd already done her research. You transitioned from being a secretary to running a multi-billion-dollar company in approximately 2 years. Can you walk us through that journey?" Sophie had prepared for this question approximately 47 times. She had talking points. She had narrative structure. She had a way of discussing her path that acknowledged the unconventionality while emphasizing the competence. "I was a secretary for 5 years, Sophie said calmly. "That position gave me deep understanding of how a company operates, not just the strategic level, but the operational level. I learned how people communicate, how decisions are actually made, how the gap between official organizational structure and actual power dynamics functions. When the opportunity arose to move into a leadership position, I was ready for it because I'd spent 5 years learning from 2 brilliant but complicated people." She was looking at Ethan when she said it, just for a moment, and she saw something shift in his expression: recognition, affection, pride. "And you had no formal business training," Patricia pressed. "No MBA," Sophie confirmed. "But I had something that I think is more valuable: direct experience managing complexity. I learned to make decisions with incomplete information. I learned to listen to people who understand things I don't. I learned to ask for help without considering it weakness. Those skills have served me better than any business school probably would have." Patricia wrote something in her notebook, and Sophie had the distinctly uncomfortable feeling that she'd just said something the journalist found interesting, in a way that might become a story. The ceremony continued, and eventually the journalists were ushered away to the reception area where Richard was providing expensive wine and carefully curated conversation opportunities. Sophie found herself being pulled in several directions by team members wanting to show her various aspects of the campus, and she gave herself over to the experience of seeing her vision actualized. Around 6 o'clock, she managed to escape to a quiet corner of the building, the observation deck that overlooked the entire campus. From this vantage point, you could see how the buildings connected, how the landscape had been deliberately designed to encourage movement between spaces, how the entire development had somehow transformed raw land into a functioning human ecosystem. "It's beautiful," Ethan said, appearing beside her without announcing himself. They were alone up here, which meant the careful professional distance could temporarily be abandoned. "It's real," Sophie said. "That's what's shocking to me. For so long, it was a sketch on a whiteboard and a budget spreadsheet, and now it's actually real. People are working in these buildings, living in the residences, collaborating on projects that wouldn't exist if this space didn't exist." "Your vision," Ethan said. "You made this happen." "Our vision," Sophie corrected. "I made the leadership decisions, but you solved the technical problems. Cameron provided the innovation direction. Elena managed the actual construction. Richard provided the capital and the belief. This wasn't one person, it was all of us." "But it was you," Ethan said quietly. "You held it together when it would have been easy to let it fall apart. You made the hard calls when the alternatives were more comfortable. You led when you had every justification for stepping back and letting someone with more experience take over." Sophie turned to face him, and they were standing close enough that it would have been easy to close the remaining distance. But they both exercised restraint because the observation deck had large windows and the reception area below wasn't that far away. I've been thinking about the future, Sophie said carefully, about what happens next. The campus is operational. The crisis is over. We're going to transition into normal operations, and I'm wondering if continuing to hide this is actually necessary. Are you suggesting we go public? Ethan asked. I'm suggesting that I'm tired of maintaining distance in professional settings, Sophie said. That I'm tired of pretending to feel nothing when you're in the same room. That I love you, and I don't want to keep it secret anymore. Ethan's entire expression shifted. Surprise, joy, a vulnerability that he usually kept carefully hidden. You love me, he said quietly. I really do, Sophie confirmed. And I think you love me too, which we should probably acknowledge directly instead of expressing through infrastructure optimization and strategic consulting. I love you, Ethan said simply. Completely. Embarrassingly completely. I spend most of my day thinking about you instead of thinking about the things I'm supposed to be thinking about. I write emails to you and then delete them because they're too personal for professional communication. I genuinely believe you're the smartest, strongest, most capable person I've ever met, and that's separate from the fact that you make me feel like maybe I'm not a complete disaster of a human being. You're not a disaster, Sophie said softly. I'm difficult, Ethan said. I'm critical and controlling, and I express affection through passive-aggressive consulting suggestions instead of like a normal person, but I want to try to be better about that. For you. I don't need you to change, Sophie said. I need you to just be honest about who you are. And you can be difficult and critical and someone who uses infrastructure optimization as emotional expression, and I can still love you. Then let's stop hiding, Ethan said. I'll announce to the board that I'm stepping down from the company entirely. That way, there's zero conflict of interest, and we can be together without compromising anything. You'd leave Blackwell Technologies? Sophie asked, surprised. For you? Ethan said. Absolutely. I could start a consulting firm, work with other companies on infrastructure and strategic planning. Or I could just disappear for a year and work on understanding what it means to be in a relationship with someone I actually respect as an equal, instead of someone I'm trying to control or manage. That's very romantic and also very dramatic, Sophie said. Very Ethan. Very Ethan, Ethan agreed, but also very sincere. I want this, Sophie. I want to see where this goes when we're not fighting it. He kissed her then, without checking to see if anyone was watching, or if it was appropriate, or if it compromised anything. It was a kiss that said, I choose you. I choose this. I choose us. When they pulled apart, Sophie was smiling despite the complicated logistics and the potential complications, and the fact that they were still technically in a professional environment. We should go back to the reception, she said. People will notice we're both missing. Let them notice, Ethan said. But yes, we should probably appear before Richard starts wondering if we've abandoned the event. The announcement came 2 weeks later during a board meeting. Ethan walked in and handed Richard a letter of resignation. Not angry, not dramatic. Just a simple statement that he was stepping away from Blackwell Technologies to pursue other opportunities, and that he was recommending that his consulting contract be terminated immediately to avoid any appearance of conflict of interest. Richard looked at the letter, looked at Sophie, looked back at the letter and actually smiled. Finally, he said, I was wondering how long you two were going to pretend that something wasn't happening. You knew? Sophie asked, genuinely shocked. Of course I knew, Richard said. I orchestrated approximately 60% of the circumstances that led to you two actually communicating like human beings instead of corporate adversaries. Did you think the dinner at Atelier Lumière happened by accident? Or that Cameron's involvement in the Costa Montagna pitch was coincidental? Cameron, sitting at the board table, tried to look innocent and failed spectacularly. You manipulated us, Sophie said, but there was no anger in it, just amazement at how thoroughly they'd been orchestrated. I provided structure for something that was going to happen anyway, Richard corrected. You two were always going to find each other. I just expedited the process because watching you dance around each other for months was painful for everyone involved. The board approved Ethan's resignation, and Blackwell Technologies continued forward with Sophie as CEO and a newly restructured leadership team that included a newly promoted VP of Operations who had been waiting in the wings for exactly this opportunity. 6 months later, on a Thursday evening in March, Sophie stood in what had once been her tiny studio apartment in the Mission District. Except it wasn't tiny anymore because she and Ethan had combined their living spaces into a larger apartment that actually had room for things like a separate bedroom and a kitchen where more than one person could stand at a time. Ethan was in the kitchen, making dinner from a recipe that he'd been working on for approximately 4 weeks, which was the kind of obsessive attention to detail that characterized absolutely everything he did. Sophie was supposed to be sitting in the living room reading, but she kept wandering into the kitchen to watch him work. "You're hovering," Ethan said, not looking up from his careful arrangement of vegetables on a cutting board. "This is a dinner I've prepared many times before. It will be successful. You don't need to monitor my progress." "I like watching you work," Sophie said, leaning against the counter. "You get this focused expression, and your hands move really precisely. It's meditative." "That's the definition of hovering with commentary," Ethan said, "but I appreciate the observation." She was thinking about how far they'd come, from her being his secretary making his cappuccinos exactly right, to them being equals in a relationship that felt genuine and easy in ways that surprised her. They'd navigated the transition from professional to personal surprisingly well. The team at Blackwell Technologies had accepted the relationship without major drama once they understood that there was no conflict of interest. The media had moved on to other stories, and Sophie was discovering that being in love with someone you actually respected was significantly better than being in love with an abstract ideal. "I have something I want to ask you," Ethan said, and Sophie felt her heart rate accelerate in a way that suggested he was about to say something important. "But I want to finish this dinner first, because I've been planning it for 6 weeks, and I will be devastated if it's ruined." "That's very Ethan," Sophie said. "Everything has to be perfectly orchestrated." "Not everything," Ethan said. "Meeting you was chaotic and terrible and resulted in a merger disaster and you losing your job. That wasn't orchestrated. That was messy and complicated and absolutely the best thing that ever happened to me." "Are you really going to tell that story when you ask me to marry you?" Sophie asked, and then immediately regretted it because she'd just revealed that she'd figured out what he was about to do. "Yes," Ethan said simply, "because it's true. You came into my life chaotically and made everything complicated, and somehow that made me better, and I want to spend the rest of my life being complicated with you." He finished the dinner. It was excellent, perfectly balanced, prepared with the kind of technical precision that suggested he'd made it approximately 50 times already. They ate at their small dining table, and Ethan told her about the consulting firm he'd started, which was surprisingly successful, and which had allowed him to work with companies that needed infrastructure optimization without having to navigate family dynamics. Sophie told him about the expansion plans for Blackwell Technologies, which included a second campus in Austin and a research facility in Seattle. They talked about the future in the way of people who were planning something together instead of separately. After dinner, Ethan led her to the window that looked out over the San Francisco skyline, and he got down on one knee with a ring that was simple and elegant and perfectly Ethan. "Sophie Mitchell," he said, and his voice carried the kind of weight that suggested he'd been thinking about this exact moment for a very long time. "I spent 5 years watching you manage chaos without asking for recognition. I spent the past 2 years watching you build something impossible from uncertainty. I spent the last 6 months falling completely in love with you in a way that feels both terrifying and absolutely right. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Sophie said. and she was crying in a way that she didn't even try to hide. Completely yes. Embarrassingly completely yes. He kissed her, and she felt the ring slide onto her finger. Perfect fit, because apparently Ethan had been planning this in the obsessive, detail-oriented way that characterized absolutely everything he did. Later, when they were texting the news to Cameron and Richard and their families, Cameron responded with a photo of himself at the Costa Montagna campus captioned, "Told you so." I orchestrated approximately 40% of this situation. Richard responded with, "I've already ordered champagne. The expensive kind. You're welcome." And Sophie realized that this moment, this exact moment where she was engaged to Ethan Blackwell, where they'd figured out how to make something complicated work, where the chaos had somehow resolved into something beautiful, was the real ending of her story. Not the ending where she became CEO, not the ending where she built a campus, but the ending where she learned that sometimes the best opportunities come from making the worst mistakes, that sometimes falling down is the only way to figure out how to stand up differently, that sometimes the person you're supposed to be with is the person who challenges you the most and respects you the deepest. She looked at Ethan, and he was looking at her with an expression so full of love and contentment that it made her want to cry all over again. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said back, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life being complicated with you in increasingly sophisticated ways." "That's very on brand," Sophie said, laughing. "It is," Ethan agreed. "I'm going to be difficult and critical, and I'm probably still going to express affection through infrastructure optimization. But I'm going to do it while married to someone who actually appreciates those qualities instead of despite them." Sophie kissed him, and through the window behind them, the San Francisco lights spread out like a promise that life could be complicated and beautiful, that success could come from unexpected places, that sometimes the secretary who breaks everything ends up fixing all the important things.